How's it going, everyone? My name is Alex, otherwise known as Yoxicola. Today I have a deck tech for my Marchesa the Black Rose Grixis deck that focuses on creatures dying and then they come back from her ability. It's a really fun deck. This I've gone through so many iterations, not of this deck in particular, but long ago. To explain this card, long ago, I got the 2017 Commander deck with Inala, the Wizard Grixis Commander, and from that deck, I made a deck for her. I didn't like it. I took it apart. Then I made a deck for Kess, which came in the deck. Didn't like it. Took it apart. Then Marisil, the Pretender, kind of liked it. Not enough. Took it apart. Back to Inala, and then finally I landed on Marchesa. And it's a really fun deck. This is definitely where I want it to be at. It has the potential to be the arch enemy of the table, but it is a little slow. So I'm looking for suggestions. If you have any, you can put them in the comments below. But thanks for watching, and let's get to the deck tech. Okay, let's start with talking about the commander, which is Marchesa. Marchesa the Black Rose, one colorless, blue, black, red for a human wizard 3/3, and it has Dethrone. So Dethrone is whenever this creature attacks the player with the most life or tied for the most life, put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then it also gives other creatures that we control Dethrone as well. So this is nice. It's kind of a weird playstyle to give all your creatures Dethrone because you don't ever really want to have the most life. The deck runs way better when you don't have the most life because it's easier to put +1/+1 counters on your creatures. I do like Dethrone though, kind of how it takes like the political aspect out of attacking someone. You don't have to just say, I'm going to choose to attack you and I don't really have a reason for it. You can say, sorry, I have to attack you. Dethrone, it says I have to. And it's, that's how the deck works. But the coolest part of the card is whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. So that's super strong. First, I just want to point out that that triggers on Marchesa. So if Marchesa dies with a 1/1 counter on her, she comes back at the beginning of the next end step, which is really nice because it's hard for your opponents to get rid of her. Basically, the only way that she can die if she has a 1/1 counter on her is if she's exiled. But we run sack outlets in the deck to prevent her from getting killed that way. So it's important to put a +1/+1 counter on her as fast as you can. I'm not going to talk about the lands in this video, but there are two lands I do want to mention. There is Opal Palace, which I don't think I have on this list because I put the wrong land in. But there's Opal Palace, which when you cast your commander, if you use that land, it comes in with a +1/+1 counter on it. So that's nice because she comes in and she's already protected. And then Forge of Heroes, you can tap this after you cast her to put a +1/+1 counter on her. So she has it and she's protected again. So the deck mainly focuses on putting creatures out there that have either entered the battlefield or die effects, and then abusing that over and over again by sacking them with 1/1 counters on them to get a lot of value. And then also there's things that do really big damage. There's things that steal opponents' creatures. It's a really fun deck. It's a little bit higher on the mana curve, so a lot of our lesser mana spells are devoted to excelling us as fast as we can to getting big mana because it's a mana dependent deck. A lot of spells cost a lot, but once it gets cooking, this is a really scary deck and it's super fun to play. Okay, so I mentioned that this deck has a lot of high mana costed stuff. That is why I run 15 pieces of ramp. You may think it's excessive. This is where I found the deck to become consistent. If you don't want to try that, go ahead, change whatever you want. Obviously, it's your deck, but this is where I think the deck sits at a consistent level, being able to do what you want it to do. Things that, don't really need to be mentioned, but I'll just kind of list them off. Arcane Signet, Dimir Signet, Izzet Signet, Rakdos Signet, Soul Ring, all three talismans. Those are just basic ramp things that you'll find in pretty much all Grixis decks. The next one is Burnished Heart. 3 mana, you can sacrifice it, find 2 lands. I like this because if you attack with it first and put a +1/+1 counter on it with Marchesa out there, then you can sacrifice it, get 2 lands, and it comes back at the end of the turn. So that's pretty nice. Direfleet Hoarder is okay. It's 2 mana. When it dies, you get to put a treasure token into play. Not that great, but if you can abuse it with Marchesa, it gets pretty good. Dockside Extortionist, I don't have a copy of yet, but I'm trading for one as soon as I can see my friend after this whole quarantine thing is over. But to be able to abuse Dockside Extortionist entering the battlefield with Marchesa is an easy way to make a ton of mana. Impulsive Pilferer. This card I didn't respect that much at first, but there is somebody who watches my videos named 8th Place Dave, which thank you Dave for talking about this card. He makes YouTube videos as well. He makes some funny ones. He makes deck techs, box openings. Pretty cool channel. Check it out. He may comment on this one, but he's commented on other ones that I've made. He talks about this card, and I really like this. It's just a better version of Direfleet Hoarder because it's 1 mana, and you get to create a treasure. So that's good with Marchesa because you can keep using that over and over and over again to make treasures. But also it has Encore, so if it's already in your graveyard, you can pay 3 mana, or 4 mana, have it come back, you get 3 treasure tokens. Unfortunately, Marchesa's ability doesn't work with tokens, so you won't get to keep any of those even when they die. But it's still a pretty strong card, so I like this in the deck, and it's only 1 mana. Pitiless Plunderer, whenever a creature you control dies, you get a treasure token. With the amount of times that we sacrifice our board, if we have 4 or 5 creatures out there that all have +1/+1 counters on it in a sack outlet, we're going to sacrifice all those creatures before our next turn, because then when they attack, they get those counters again. So we can make a lot of mana with this card. Solemn Simulacrum, pretty obvious. When it comes into play, you get to find a land. When it dies, you draw a card. So we're happy when it leaves or when it comes back onto the field. Strong card in the deck. And then this card is disgusting. Treasonous Ogre, 4 mana for it already has Dethrone, which is just nice, but you can pay 3 life and add red to your mana pool. This is good for 2 reasons. One, we can ramp a ton with this if we get greedy and we want to play a big spell by losing a bunch of life. But we don't really care about losing life too much in this deck because we just don't want to have the most life. This deck excels when it is not on the throne, and you can attack someone to put counters on your creatures. So this card is very strong, but I promise when your opponents read what it does, it's probably going to get removed pretty quickly. We've entered my favorite part of any deck, which is card advantage. So this is where you're going to start seeing how high mana costed a lot of the spells are, but that's why we run 15 pieces of ramp. First is Combustible Gearhulk, which is good that we run this card with a bunch of high mana costed stuff, because when it enters the battlefield, choose a player. They either get to let you draw 3 cards, or you mill 3 cards and they take damage to the total converted mana cost. That could be really dangerous for them to make you put those in your graveyard because we run a lot of stuff that's high costed. So they can take a ton of damage, but usually because we can abuse this trigger over and over and over again with Marchesa, we're just going to get to draw a lot of cards. Itali, not really any synergy with Marchesa, but I just think it's a fun card. You get to attack, exile 3 cards, or 4 cards, and then you get to play any of them that aren't lands. So, pretty fun. Gonti is really annoying for your opponents to deal with because when it continues to enter the battlefield over and over and over again, you're going to have a lot. You get to look at 4 cards, but you also get to, you choose one of them and you get to play it whenever you want to and play mana as though it was any type. So, you get to look at the top 4 cards of somebody's life. This card has saved me in games before because I've been able to find answers that I normally wouldn't have access to in other players' decks. So this is a really strong card. Grim Haruspex, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, draw a card. Makes sense. Harvester of Souls, whenever another non-token creature dies from anybody, you draw a card. Phyrexian Arena is just a good card to have. You lower your life by 1, which that doesn't really matter that much, but you get to draw an extra card every turn. Pilgrim's Eye, it's card advantage because it puts cards into your hand. It enters the battlefield because it is 3 colors. I want to make sure that we have the right colored land to play. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Rhystic Study. It's Rhystic Study. I don't think it needs any more explanation. River Kelpie. Whenever it or another permanent enters the battlefield from a graveyard, draw a card. Whenever a player casts a spell from a graveyard, draw a card. That's any player, by the way. Any permanent from a graveyard. So even if your opponents are reanimating stuff, or they're recurring creatures out of their graveyard, or casting flashback spells, or anything like that, this card is drawing you cards. And it has persist itself, so it's going to come back in and draw you a card regardless. And the way persist works with Marchesa is when it attacks, it just loses that -1/-1 counter. So it'll come back again when it dies. So you can keep this thing out there pretty easily. And with all the stuff coming in to the battlefield from your graveyard, you're going to draw a ton of cards just by yourself. And if anybody else at the table is doing that as well, your hand is going to be full for the rest of the game. And then Sage of Fables, I really, really like this card. First, it's 3 mana, which is 1 mana less than Marchesa. The reason I like that is because you can usually get this out there before Marchesa. And then each wizard creature that comes into play under your control comes in with a +1/+1 counter on it. So Marchesa will come in and already be protected by its own ability. And then there's other wizards in the deck too that we also are happy that this gives 1/1 counters to. But you can also pay 2 mana, remove a 1/1 counter from a creature and draw a card, which is nice. Okay, so now let's get to the removal of the deck. I run a lot of ways of killing a bunch of creatures. And one of the best ways to do that is Blasphemous Act, because, so first it's 9 mana, so Combustible Gearhulk loves this card because it's going to do 9 damage to someone if they make you mill it, but also it's never going to actually cost you 9 mana, and it does 13 damage to each creature. But what's great about Marchesa is that if a board wipe like this happens, and your creatures have +1/+1 counters on them, Marchesa sees all of them die. Like, she's able to still have her ability trigger. So if all your board has +1/+1s on it, your entire board comes back at the end of the turn. Super strong effect. Chaos Warp. It's Chaos Warp. If you need to get rid of something, do it and pray that it or something worse doesn't get put back onto the table. Cyclonic Rift, just a good removal spell in blue. Decree of Pain. Technically, the creatures aren't getting regenerated by Marchesa's ability, so this is really strong because your creatures again are going to come back, and you're drawing a card for each creature that was destroyed that way. Dictate of, it's either Erebos or a Rabo. It's probably a Rabo. 5 mana flash. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. Yeah, none of your opponents are gonna have creatures with how many times you are sacrificing creatures with this deck. So really, really strong. If your opponents can't deal with this, then you're just gonna kind of walk away with the game. Profaner of the Dead is nice because it lets you sacrifice a creature if you don't have a sack outlet out there. So you can sack a creature, and then it's like a little mini Cyclonic Rift for creatures based on what their toughness is. So this card can be good. It's not unbelievably strong, but it can be good in situations. It's really good at getting rid of small tokens. Tragic Slip, it's just 1 mana, and you can give something -13/-13 until the end of the turn. Most of the time, I would save this for a creature that has Indestructible or something like that, because this is a good way of getting around that. And, we have the ability to basically make sure a creature is going to die every turn with our sack outlets and the other stuff we run in the deck. And then Vandal Blast. This is just a really strong card. A lot of decks, especially decks that don't have green in them, heavily rely on artifacts. So the ability to just destroy all of them, especially with stuff like Hull Breacher now and Smothering Tithe, those treasure tokens are artifacts. So they kind of have to just use all of them because they're not going to have another time to use them. They're about to get destroyed. So I really like this card. So I've mentioned that this deck needs ways of sacrificing the creatures so that they can die. Marchesa sees them die, and then they come back into play. So these are the best ways of doing it that I have in the deck. There are other ways, but these cards are devoted to just sacrificing creatures. That's all they're in the deck for, and some of them have a little bit extra. So Ashnod's Altar, 3 mana to sacrifice a creature. It's an artifact that you can sacrifice a creature to, add 2 colorless to your mana pool. This helps us get to the high costed mana spells that we have, but also we can sacrifice things at instant speed. Carrion Feeder, 1 mana. It can't block, we don't care. Sacrifice a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on Carrion Feeder. That's great that it gets counters. It'll come back if it dies, and Marchesa sees it with those +1/+1 counters, which is really nice, so it's hard to get rid of this one. But it's in there so that we can sack creatures when we need to. Sadistic Hypnotist is a 5 mana 2/2, and this card is just mean. If you have enough creatures out there, so you can only do this at sorcery speed, but sacrifice a creature, target player discards 2 cards. You can just empty the hands of your opponents. You can ask, you can sacrifice this card too to itself if it has a 1/1 counter on it. So sacrifice your board, then sacrifice this, then they all come back. Your opponents don't have any cards left in their hand, so you're just going to run away with the game because you have answers and they don't have any. They're just top decking from there on out. Viscera Seer, another 1-drop. Sacrifice a creature, scry 1. That's good. We just need it to sacrifice stuff. And then Yahenni. Yahenni's good. It's a 2/2 hasty boy. Sacrifice another creature. It gets indestructible until the end of the turn, so it's nice because you can protect Yahenni. And then also you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this one is probably going to stay out there unless somebody exiles it because it's getting +1/+1 counters on it. So it's going to come back anyways, but also you could sacrifice something to make it indestructible. Really hard to deal with. Okay, so I have 2 sections I'm going to go over now. The first one is called I'll Take That, because the way Marchesa's ability works is it doesn't matter which graveyard that card goes into. If it has a +1/+1 counter on it and you control it, it's coming back at the end of the turn. So Captivating Crew, you can pay 4 mana and you will take somebody's creature until the end of the turn. It gains haste. So you're going to attack whoever has the most life with it, put a +1/+1 counter on it, sacrifice it, and then Marchesa will see that that card was out there with its ability, and then that card will be under your control at the end of the turn, and you just get to keep it. So really strong effect because you get to steal a lot of stuff. Grave Betrayal, I think, was made for this deck. 7 mana, but whenever a creature you don't control dies, return it to the battlefield under your control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Basically, if this is out there with Marchesa, any creature that dies on the board that you don't control, you're going to control after that. Hijack, gain control of target artifact or creature until the end of the turn. It gains haste. Insurrection. This used to be just a card that would win you the game. It still can win you the game, but if it doesn't, you don't even need Marchesa out there. Because if Marchesa is out there, you get to steal all the creatures that you gain control of, which is unbelievable. As long as they're not tokens, you can't steal tokens. But, sorry, you get to steal tokens with this card, but when you sacrifice them, they don't come back. So you get to take everything for the turn, attack with it, sack them all. If you have Marchesa out there, great. You're going to get all those non-token creatures back at the end of the turn. If you don't have Marchesa out there, that's fine. Now you just did a one-sided board wipe of creatures because you sacrificed everything that you took. Mark of Mutiny. Same thing as Hijack, except you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gets haste. So if you don't have a way of putting a +1/+1 counter on it, or you're on the throne for some reason, you still get to keep this the card that you sacrifice because it has a +1/+1 on it. Molten Primordial, it has haste for 7 mana. When it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, gain control of up to 1 target creature they control until the end of the turn. But again, we are attacking with them at the person with the most life. They're going to get +1/+1 counters on them, and then we will sacrifice them, and we'll get to keep all 3 of those creatures. And then this is a new one from Commander Legends, and I'm really excited to play it. So it's a 5 mana 4/3 pirate. It's Zara Renegade Recruiter. It has flying. Whenever it attacks, look at the defending player's hand, put a creature card from it onto the battlefield under your control tapped and attacking that player. Return that creature to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So it's not coming into play before you attack, so you don't get the dethrone trigger, which kind of stinks because it's hard to put a +1/+1 counter on it. I think we have 2 ways of doing it, but it's very likely you won't be able to steal it. If you can, that's absolutely broken that you can just take creatures out of an opponent's hand and just not even pay. It's like a sneak attack, except better, based on, you're taking something from someone else's hand. But even if you don't have the ability to put the +1/+1 counter on it, you can just sacrifice it. So you're just taking problematic creature cards out of your opponent's hands, sacrificing them, and now it's basically you just chose to discard a card from them, and it gets to attack them. And then lastly, I have just 2 tutors in the deck. Final Parting is only in the deck because I really like when these cards have haste, because they are able to put a +1/+1 counter on themselves sooner rather than later, and Marchesa can protect them. So I have Anger. Anger is in the deck. That is 90% of the time what I'll be putting in the graveyard. There's maybe like one or two other things, but most of the time it's Anger. And then you also get to put a card in your hand. And then Sidisi, you can use this ability over and over and over again by putting a +1/+1 counter on it, and you can exploit itself uh, to its ability. I wish it was a wizard and not a Naga, because then it would really work well with that one wizard that puts a +1/+1 counter on your creatures when they enter the battlefield if they're a wizard. But regardless, the ability to continuously search for cards is really strong. Okay, let's talk about how this deck wins the game. Direfleet Ravager is a 5-mana Orc Pirate Wizard, all the things. When it enters the battlefield, each player loses a third of their life rounded up. With a couple triggers of this, everybody at the table is going to be dangerously low, and you're going to be able to finish the game. Maybe with this, but more importantly, it lowers their life to a point where the next cards I'm talking about are going to just win you the game. First is Flayer of the Hatebound, and it's similar to Warstorm Surge. Both of these care about when your creatures enter the battlefield. Flayer of the Hatebound is only when they enter the battlefield from your graveyard, but with Marchesa's synergy, most of the creatures that will be entering the battlefield are entering from the graveyard. So this and Warstorm Surge do damage to any target when a creature enters the battlefield based on its power. So with the amount of times that we're sacrificing our creatures and bringing them back, you can machine gun down your opponents or creatures that they have. Very strong effects. And then also Flayer of the Hatebound has Undying, which is a really good synergy with Marchesa. I don't have a copy of Machias, but if I did, I would put it in the deck, because when our creatures have Undying, that means that they come back to play when they have a 1/1 counter on them and when they don't have a 1/1 counter on them. So this and Marchesa are a match made in heaven, because it's hard to get rid of this. Stalking Vengeance is very good because it deals damage. It's the same thing as those two cards, except it cares about when your creatures die. So now if you have this and one of those two cards out there, whenever a creature dies, you're doing damage, and then it comes back and it does damage again. So this card can do a lot of damage to your opponents. And then the last two are Gary and Kakusho. Kakusho is really good because if you have the ability to continue to put 1/1 counters on this, even though you're not on, or you can become the highest life total at the table with this card because you're gaining 15 life. So you want to make sure that you're set up in a good position before playing this to close out the game, because you're gonna lose the ability to put your +1/+1 counters onto things because of Dethrone. But it does 5 damage to each opponent, or they each lose 5 life, and then you gain 15 life. And then Gary's the same thing. It just kind of depends on how much devotion to black you have out there. If you have a lot, great, you're draining the table for a ton and you're gaining a ton of life. This is really strong if you're, at a dangerously low life total and you need to stay in the game. But also it's good at closing out the game because you're going to have this happening over and over and over again. This last section of the deck is just hot nonsense. I didn't really know where else to put it, so I'll just talk about it now because I don't know where else I would have talked about it in the video. But first is Anger. It's just in here to give our stuff haste, as I mentioned before. If it's in the graveyard and we control a mountain, all of our stuff has haste. Apprentice Necromancer is kind of a weird card. Basically, it's a 2-mana 1/1 wizard. You can pay a mana, tap it, sacrifice it, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature gains haste. At the beginning of the next end step, sacrifice it. So if that creature that you bring back attacks the person with the highest life total, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it, and because of Marchesa, it'll come back into play at the end of the turn. It's kind of like Sneak Attack, which if I had Sneak Attack, I would put a copy in this deck, but I don't have a copy. And then also, I guess if you were set up to do this the right way, you can put a +1/+1 counter on this with either another way of doing it or attacking with the throne and then activating its ability. So after you sacrifice it, it'll come back into play at the end of the next, or at the beginning of the next end step as well. So you can keep using this over and over again. Flame Shadow Conjuring just lets you make tokens of things that are entering the battlefield, which is strong because we have a lot of different things that care about our creatures entering the battlefield. Puppeteer Clique, you get to have it enter the battlefield, take a creature card from an opponent's graveyard, put it onto the battlefield, it gains haste. At the beginning of the next end step, exile it. So you need a sack outlet so that when you attack the person with the highest life total, you put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. Then you get to keep it after you sacrifice it because of Marchesa. And then this itself has Persist, which we've already talked about. Works really well with Marchesa because eventually it's kind of a never-ending loop as long as you're able to attack with this and put a +1/+1 counter on it, because that negates the -1/-1 counter. Reform is kind of a weird card, but it's really strong because it's a 4-mana 0/1. When it dies, you make a 3/3 fish. Okay, so we'll just stop right there. When it dies, you make a 3/3 fish. So if you have a +1/+1 counter on this and it dies, it'll come back at the end of the turn, and now you'll have a fish and the worm. And because we run sack outlets in this deck, we can just turn that fish that when it dies, it turns into a 6/6 whale, that when that dies, it turns into a 9/9 kraken. We can just slowly create an army of 9/9 kraken creatures with this. Shifting Shadow, kind of confusing, but so you play this card and enchant a creature. This is how you should usually play this card. You have Marchesa out there, you enchant another creature. That creature will attack the person with the most life total, put a +1/+1 counter on it. If they don't kill it, great. Then on your next upkeep, you sacrifice that creature, find the next creature off the top of your library, put it into play, and now it has haste. Then you can attack the next person with the highest life total, put a +1/+1 creature on that, and then the creature that was originally attached to Shifting Shadow comes back at the end of the turn. So you can just kind of cheat creatures in for free with this card as long as they don't get rid of the enchantment or kill the creature when it's attacking. The Ozolith is just a really good card. It's 1-mana artifact. When a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, move all those counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. I wish you could move all of them onto any number of creatures and spread it out. Obviously, that would be insane. But this is a good way of keeping those counters, and you can put those on things even if you're not attacking the person with the highest life total. Unspeakable Symbol might be the best card in the deck, just as far as synergy-wise. Pay 3 life, that's fine. We like being at a lower life total so we're not on the throne, but also you get to just put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And you can do this at instant speed, so you can lose 3 life, put a counter on something. If you have like Gary or Kakusho, you're going to gain that life back anyways, because when it dies, it comes back into play, it gains you life. Really good card, and if you have this out there, your opponents better get rid of this, because this is really something that just turns your deck on to the next level. Victimize is a way to sacrifice a creature, which is good if we don't have an outlet out there. And then we return 2 cards from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped, 2 creature cards. Good way of getting back pieces that have been dealt with when we didn't have Marchesa out there. It's just a good card. I really like that it lets you sacrifice something. And then Vindictive Lich is the last one. 4 mana for a 4/1 zombie. 4/1 zombie is actually, if this is attacking the person with the most life, it turns into a 5/2, which is actually pretty nice. But when it dies, target opponent sacrifices a creature, target opponent discards 2 cards, and target opponent loses 5 life. You can only target one of those at each player, but you're going to be able to use this over and over and over again. So being able to make somebody sacrifice creatures, maybe they're playing Voltron or something, choose them to sacrifice a creature. Maybe somebody doesn't have a way of drawing cards or has too many cards in their hand. Target them, they discard 2 cards, and then you can drain people out for 5 life with this. So using this over and over and over again, it's just a versatile card, and I think it does a good job in the deck. So that is my Marchesa the Black Rose deck tech. It's, in my opinion, probably the most confusing commander I've ever built a deck around, just because its trigger is kind of weird, and I don't know, it's just interesting the way it interacts with a lot of cards. So please let me know if you have any questions about it, or if I didn't explain something well enough, let me know and I will respond to you in the comments below. But this is a really, really, really fun deck. It can run away with the game, and I've gotten it to that consistent level. You just need to get to that point where you can, get enough mana to do what you need to do, because as you saw, there are a lot of high-costed spells in the deck. But I really like it. I think it's super fun, and yeah. If you have any other thoughts, please let me know in the comments below. If you haven't liked and subscribed already, please do. That would help out a lot. And I'll see you next time. Thanks.